It's late in this conference, and I'm sure those of you who are not speakers want to also be speakers, and what is on your mind should really have a lot of room in this session. This topic is of central importance for economic development in Africa and beyond. The world currently has about 1.5 billion people under age 15 and about 1.2 billion people in the age group of 15 to 25 years. Such large numbers of people before entering the job market and aspiring to have productive jobs, the world has never seen before. In Africa, annually about 30 million people are entering the job market or not, because there is no job. But they enter the age bracket of employability. We all know also that in Africa, children are working at very young age as child laborers. Boys and girls do so. Agriculture is the largest employer of children. It's not the manufacturing sector. We had last year the G20 meeting in Germany, and we had organized a conference on what's called creating opportunities with the young generation in the rural world. Creating opportunities with, not for, with the young generation in the rural world. That G20 conference in Berlin was organized with, for instance, 150 young rural entrepreneurs from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was coordinated by Agnes Kalibata and myself, both not in the youth bracket. Nevertheless, we feel it was Agnes Kalibata, president of AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution. A communique, the Berlin Charter, was released there. The Berlin Charter was put in front of the heads of state of the G20, a call to action, and it focused mainly on issues of education, jobs, and hunger quickly, and give us access to modern communication tools. Those were the clear pleas by the young folks with whom we had worked for, actually there were for 2 weeks in Germany. I encourage you to look at the Berlin Charter. If you put in Berlin Charter G20, it pops up on the website. We have an excellent panel before us. They currently turn their backs to you, but they will turn around in a moment. They each have maximum 5 minutes speaking time. And then they will get an opportunity to interact with you in Q&A sessions. The first speaker will be Dr. Oliver Kirui. Oliver has his MSc degree from the University of Nairobi. He got his PhD from the University of Bonn in agricultural economics. Those of you who keep coming to these meetings remember Oliver from the Milan meeting, because he got there the award for the best visual presentation. He is currently a senior researcher at the Center for Development Research and is like several of the other speakers, engaged in the program of accompanying research for innovation in food and agriculture in Africa and South Asia, the so-called PARI project. You find a few leaflets around the room what this project is about. Oliver, I'd like to ask you to come forward. Oliver's doctoral research, by the way, was on the economics of land degradation, but currently he engages deeply in the economics of education and vocational training and facilitating improvement of the job opportunities of youth. Oliver, you are 4.5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you all of you for coming for this to this session to discuss matters youth, and discuss matters agriculture and matters Africa. I'm a very proud scientist when I work on topics that have very direct implication to young people in Africa, because I quite relate with young people in Africa, and of course as an African I relate to a lot of the things that go around or go about in terms of agricultural production and agricultural value chains. But sometimes I'm not very proud when I see the numbers, especially when we talk about the youth unemployment and when we talk about things that bother the community. To continue with the numbers that Professor Von Braun just mentioned a short while ago, a study by the IMF and the World Bank a few years ago, 2015, indicated that close to about 50 million young people in Africa are in what we call precarious employment, jobs that not necessarily be able to be sustained beyond the season, a few months or so. And additionally, then there are some few seats here, if you can, please. And additionally, thank you. And additionally, the same report indicated that we will need about 20 million new jobs every year to be able to employ the young people and be able to meet with the challenge that we've been faced for many years. I'll come shortly to this slide, but in addition to this, I've been doing quite a number of reviews and research and looking at available data sets, and I realized that actually there are far few training opportunities available for the young people, especially in the rural areas. So many young people are reaching employability age, or they reach a group in which, a time in which they need to be in employment, but they don't have the requisite skills and they don't have the requisite level of education that would push them out of agriculture, push them out of the rural areas. In about 21 countries, a study was commissioned by the German ministry, PMZ, and in collaboration, of course, with GIZ, and 10,000 rural youth were asked a few questions about what they would see them, so where they would see themselves in the next 5 years. And unlike what we would think and say that everyone wants to run away from the rural areas, only 23% of these youth would say they wanted to move to the capital city, or just another 18% saying they want to move to the next or the other big city, not the capital city. But there is an opportunity in which about 52%, more than half of these youth, say they will either be in the city or in the rural area, depending on where the conditions would be good for them. So there is an opportunity, and there is a window that we could actually use the resource that we have in the young people in terms of their ability, in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their capacity to do the agricultural activities, if we make conditions in agriculture worthwhile. What are the things that the youth see that would make attractive, that would make agriculture very attractive? Number one, they want to see more employment opportunities in the agricultural sector. So this means that we need to move beyond just production and look at the value chain and bring more activities and bring more things and more value into the rural communities by increasing processing and increasing value addition within the agricultural value chains. The other thing, which is also more than a third of these youth talk about, is that they need more educational possibilities in the rural areas. Infrastructural development that was ranked at third with 18%, and of course support for agriculture, startup in agriculture, financial assistance and so forth. About 15% of the youth said if that would be done, they would be willing actually to stay in rural areas and engage in agriculture. If you look at education generally, and I know my time is running out. If you look at education generally, about 70% of primary school going children in Sub-Saharan Africa are able to enroll in primary school. But if you follow through that, the attrition rate is so high. Only about 60% of those that enroll in primary school would be able to go into high school. But even more surprisingly, that only 36% or thereabout in Sub-Saharan Africa would be able to graduate and complete high school, I mean senior secondary school. 6% or thereabout, generally in Sub-Saharan Africa, would be able to go into tertiary education. So we have a youth problem, or we have a youth challenge, that there are many, many young people that are reaching employment level or periods, yet they don't have the requisite skill. Most of them never completed school, or if they completed school, they completed quite very low levels of education. So we need to think, my minutes are over, we need to think skills and need to think how we can improve the capacity of these young people to operate.
And we will have to come back to that, how to move forward to vocational and technical education in rural areas. After each presentation, there should be room for one or two very quick questions related to understandings and so on. Later on, they will, as a group, be available. Anyone would like to ask a quick question to Oliver? Please go ahead and always say who you are and where you are from.
Gideon Kruzman from CIMIT. In countries where there has been major education pushes, especially North Africa, it has led to the situation where young people are highly educated and unemployed. So it might, although it might look attractive to say we need to improve education, that's not enough.
Okay.
I don't want to respond to that because it will start another debate that we want to go into. But yes, I agree with you that education alone and making provision of education is a necessary but not sufficient solution.
Okay. And we want to drive the debate towards how to generate the jobs. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Tekalin Zaketa. Tekalin got his MSc degrees in Haryana in Ethiopia and in Antwerp, and his doctoral degree at University of Bonn, with work on the aspirations of youth, of rural youth, and the flip side of it, their relative deprivations. So the feelings, how they are formed, the role of parents, mother, father, community matter in order to identify how to deal with these 52%. Tekalin, please come. We will talk about motivations.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Joachim von Braun. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Professor von Braun highlighted, I did my PhD on rural use in agriculture. Specifically, I was interested on the behavioral aspect of it. Today, I'm going to talk about how aspirations, specifically how the performance of others affects youth labor participation, specifically in rural areas. But the question, before I highlight on that, I just want to begin on the last argument Oliver brought. Whenever we think of this huge labor force, young people in Africa in general, there are two arguments, basically. One argues that this labor force could be a driving force for rural transformation. In other words, they could be change agents. But however, there are also others who argue they are the lost generations because they lack the necessary resources to participate in or to innovate. But the question is, the government cannot invest in all of this. As you all know, there is shortage of funds or resources. One approach to create that is to raise aspirations. As we all know, aspirations are very important for innovation or to achieve a higher level of satisfaction. So the question is, how do aspirations could be created or could be induced among rural youth. One approach is through the peer effect. I hope you all know peer effect, right? So the idea of this peer effect is, if you see also the agricultural adoption and introduction in 1980s and in 1990s in Africa, there is the so-called model farmer schools or farmer field schools. The basic idea there is, if we invest on model farmers, others can mimic that technology, so that technology adoption could be high. It's interesting, I find out in my study that the performance of others highly influences technological adoption, not only technological adoption, but also innovation, surprisingly. So it's very important to raise the aspiration of these young people through, for example, the follow of the model farmers approach. Not only that, however, raising these aspirations and doing this sort of stuff requires not only the capability of youth, as Professor Von Braun mentioned, it also requires changing the attitudes of their parents, basically fathers and mothers. So when policy or development agents think of transforming this rural youth, it is very important also to consider the intra-household resource allocation, specifically the role of fathers and the mothers. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you are interested on this aspect, I am very privileged and happy to share you more insights on how this could be happening.
For a moment, this was very condensed work of 3.5 years. Particularly, any clarifications required? The concepts of aspiration, of relative deprivation, pioneer Professor Odette Stark focused on the latter a lot, are critical for what we are talking about here. Overcoming aspiration failures, or get out. Go ahead.
What does it mean, the attitudes of the fathers and mothers? What type of attitude is good for?
That is a very important question. You know, especially when we consider of young people, as I said earlier, they lack necessary resources to form their career path. So, which means they depend on the fathers and the mothers. When I talk of expectation of fathers and the mothers, your level career choice, for example, doesn't depend only on the capability of the youth individual, but also on the preference of the father and the mother. So sometimes father or mother decides an individual to take the farm or to pursue education. That's what I mean by the role of fathers and the mothers' expectation in that. And it's very interesting that in my study, the common logic we all argue is that the preference of fathers are more important for the career choice of the especially girls. But I find out the opposite, and it could be another debate, but especially the role of fathers when it comes to youth employment and culture determines a lot than mothers. As we all know, fathers have control and access over resources. So they are the ones who decide most and who has the upper hand to determine who has and how much has to be invested on that specific individual in that household.
What about these model farmers?
These model farmers, the point is, for example, in the concept of relative deprivation, I didn't talk much detail because of time constraint. When you talk of this kind of stuff, you have to remember always the peer effect. Peer effect, in a sense, individuals form their aspirations or their goal to aspire a certain high level of thing based on what others do. So if you see that effect, it is very key for young people to become an entrepreneur, to pursue education, or to pursue a certain business types.
Okay,
That's what I mean by it.
So we have to come back to economics of social psychology in order to address this. Georgina Wambui is our next speaker. Georgina got her master's degrees also from Kenya, a PhD from University of Bonn. Her work was on household economic issues in the context of water system economics in South Africa. But in the last couple of years, Georgina has mainly focused her research on gender and innovation. Georgina, please come here. You are advocating a gender lens in order to address this in equitable ways, these employment issues.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bonbon, for your kind introduction. And yes, I highlight the women aspect. As many of us may know that women provide a huge share of agricultural labor force in the rural areas of Africa. Yet they continue to remain at the bottom of the value chains. They continue to receive little or zero benefit from their activities. Young girls as well, as Professor has already mentioned, are employed by the agricultural sector. And these young girls are at a very critical stage in their lives. It's at this stage that the bigger stage for later years is set. And this stage seems to have been forgotten in the development debate, whereby focus has been mainly on early childhood and development. So there's something that is missing, and this gap needs to be filled because young girls have the key or are very pivotal in terms of stopping or breaking the transmission of intergenerational poverty. Therefore, time is now to invest in young girls. We need to look into their education, look into their skills, and as it's already mentioned, education might not be enough. So this education needs to target the needs of young girls, and this is to impart skills that are going to enable them to face the future or to face the future head on. If these investments are lacking, then it means, given the changes that are taking place at this age of between 15 and 24 years, we know that there are various changes that they might be in control. The young girls might not be in control of, and if we don't invest in their lives, then it means that this period becomes a stage of great risk, great fears, and it's like already we are mutating them to go into the next steps of their future.
Can you give us something on how does agricultural technology on the farm relate to this group of adolescent girls?
In terms of technology, I think the best technology for rural women and young girls is technologies that will enable, or rather will reduce on their, not reduce is not the word, labor-saving technologies that will enhance their productivities, that will enhance their incomes, technologies that are energy efficient, technologies that are affordable for the women, and overall technologies that are going to enhance their general well-being.
The topic is very timely. The G7 met this year in Canada, and one of the very few things they achieved was to launch a multi-billion-dollar fund on adolescent girls. Mr. Trudeau, head of state of this country, was pushing for that. Money will only make a difference if we can help them with some good research. Thank you, Georgina. We'll come back to that. Our next speaker is Essa Musa from Ethiopia. He got his master's degree from Egerton and from Antwerp. And his doctoral degree he's working on almost done, is on childhood work and work experience and income in later in life. Essa, tell us about the childhood work issue and how can productive employment come about?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. So, I'm still working on finalizing my PhD and ready for defense on the long-term effects of child labor on human capital formation, migration decisions, and earnings later in life. So I'll just explain this later, but let me just give you some background about why I decided to look at this issue, because in Ethiopia, almost a quarter of children are child laborers, and of which 1 in every 3 children were full-time child laborers, which also affects their schooling, because over the last decade, the child education in Ethiopia has improved significantly. But then almost half of children, they dropped out of school before they finished their primary education and then joined the labor market to work, and which actually result in the lower human education level, characterizing the labor market, and lower human capital in the labor market, and also higher illiteracy in the labor market, which affect the whole overall economic growth and development. So against this background, I followed up about 800 rural children who were between 4 and 14 years old during the baseline survey. Then I followed up and tracked them after 16 years, when they are between 20 and 30 years old, and looked at how they are working or how they are doing in the labor market, their human capital formation, how far they moved over the last 16 years in terms of accumulating human capital or education, and also whether they have moved out from the rural areas to different parts of the country, to the other rural areas or urban areas, generally their migration, and their occupational trajectories, what are they doing, whether what they are doing right now has anything to do with their childhood characteristics and their earnings in the labor market. So what I found is that, so in this study, among a number of indicators, I measured child labor as children who combine schooling and working, those who were exclusively schooling or exclusively working, or combining schooling and working. So I will focus on this parameter of child labor for the discussion. So what I found is that those who were full-time childhood workers or laborers, they did not move far in their schooling even after 16 years. Rather, those who were combining schooling and working attained twice many years of schooling compared to those who full-time childhood laborers. And also, in terms of migration, those who were exclusively working during their childhood, who actually later on had lower human capital, most of them remained in the rural area, working in agriculture, while those combined schooling and working, and those full-time childhood school children, they moved to urban areas, and most of them, they are working in non-farm economic activities. And in terms of their earnings, how much they are earning right now. So this is the earnings distribution, the expected annual income based on the occupation they are currently working in. So those who are combining schooling and working, the black line, that they earn better income in self-employment, low-skilled jobs. Whereas those who were exclusively schooling during their childhood, they were earning better in formal employment. So my argument was that those who were combining schooling and working, they might have attained or earned some level of skills that are relevant in the self-employment or low-skill jobs. Whereas those who were exclusively working during their childhood, they earn lower income in all the occupations, be it in farming or in self-employment or skilled or formal employment. These are my studies, and welcome.
So you see here, that's what you of course expect. Those who were at school are doing better than those who stay mainly at home and are child laborers. But the new information out of this analysis is this black line.
Yeah.
On average, actually, those who do quite a bit of work are doing better than those who were only at school.
Yeah.
There seems to be a crossover point. Tell them.
Some complementarity of skills.
Yeah.
That's my argument. There could be some complementarity of skills between working and schooling, and children might also might have the opportunity to develop occupational aspiration to work in the non-farm economic activities. And also there's a likelihood of using those skills that they have learned during their childhood in these low-skilled self-employment activities or jobs.
Yeah. Please go ahead. ILO may not like your suggestions, Tessa. You target them, be careful. Actually, the crossover point was not more than 2 hours a day, and still go to school. Please, madam.
I have a more technical question. I would be very interested in your experiences or thoughts on how to measure child labor, because at least according to our experience, it's very difficult because it's a sensitive issue. So I'm really wondering if, small case studies, but also national representative surveys are actually underestimating incidences of child labor. So I would be very interested in your experience or view how to best measure.
Okay. In this study, the baseline survey was conducted by IFPRI, which is part of the Ethiopian Rural Household Survey. So I just picked the fields around this survey and used the available data. So child labor was measured by the number of hours children worked in the last 7 days, regardless of any activities, be it in farming or in domestic activities. And also when the child started working, the age at which they started working. And third, this combination of working and schooling, whether over the last 12 months the child was combining attending school, also working. These are the three measures that are available. But as I said, these are self-reported and sometimes recalled, so there could be some bias. You cannot capture fully the activity.
So you would agree that we are probably underestimating?
There could be.
I don't think so, in particular, because let's give proper credit. The child labor survey was done 15, 16 years ago by Asefa Admasi, who at that time was also at the Center for Development Research. And this is the long-standing Ethiopia panel data set, where there's a lot of trust between community and the data collectors. I wouldn't be so sure about this simply moving in and say, hey, let me know how your children work. So this is a fairly reliable survey.
But in that survey, parents were asked, right? So you didn't ask.
No, we also went after the children.
Okay.
Yeah, all the way to 4-year-olds. I'm afraid we have to move on and then come back to this. Is there? No, you look angry if I don't take.
Just wanted to have self-employment, low-skill job. Did any one of them eventually end up in the high-skill formal employment? Did any of the sample in the population that you surveyed from? No, you have this category, self-employed, low-skill jobs. You were saying they were employed doing the job at the same time they are also studying, right? I would know whether any one of them in the sample ended up eventually in the skilled formal employment, because it might take some time, but it might end up there too.
This one?
Yeah.
Actually, there are some children who are working in the formal employment. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to our last not least speaker, Thomas Baum from University of Hohenheim. studied business administration and agricultural economics. His current main research, completing his doctoral degree, is on mechanization issues. But he very much looks also into intra-household allocation of resources and including time. He will not talk about what you recently got an award for, an app that is used to measure time by all household members. But we close with a piece of art. Tell us about this one.
Please.
Please.
Exactly. You said before that we are maybe a bit tired after 4 or 5 days of conference. So we want to talk a lot, and maybe we also don't want to see numbers, but we want to see some drawings. That's why I brought these drawings. So thanks for organizing this wonderful session. So there is a lot of talk on African youth and that we need to invest in them. And some people say that youth is somehow the new gender. And I think we certainly can learn a lot from the gender debate, especially that we don't want to have a male versus female kind of thing, and we also don't want to have an older generation versus a younger generation kind of thing. That is what you kind of refer to. That we also need to look at the aspirations of older people because they invest in the education of their children, for example. And Joachim von Braun made it very convincingly clear why do we need to invest in rural African youth. But how to do so is somehow more debated, and some people talk about mechanization, others talk about ICTs, and all of this may make sense, but in this study we actually asked rural agricultural children themselves what do they think, what do they want. And we did interviews and we also let them draw pictures on how do they imagine the perfect farm, how do they imagine town, life in towns. And I want to have a bit of an optimistic output. So what I want to say is that actually a lot of rural people are very excited to be farmers. They are proud to be farmers, they enjoy the social embeddedness of village life. In contrast, they may have some reverse attitude against city life. We see here someone due to fightings and drug abuse. So not everyone is not liking farming. Many people are excited about farming, and not everyone is automatically drawn towards cities. So this kind of push-pull theory of migration is certainly not true. There are some holding factors as well. Now the young people we talk to, they still have very nuanced perspectives. They understand that there are good things about farming and other things that are not good. And what they always said is they don't like the risk associated with farming. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we want to create jobs. We don't want to create very uncertain jobs also. We want to create meaningful and safe jobs. Many people want to become teachers or nurses, not because they find this meaningful or interesting, but because these are government jobs and they pay well. But this is kind of the good message. The rural space is not lost. Young people may find it hugely attractive to be there, which was also coming up in the first presentation, this 52% who don't know where they want to be yet. Here we can certainly come in, but how do we do that? There's a big diversity of what young people reported to want to have or they inspire. We asked them to draw the perfect farm, and what you see is that actually very few do tractors or ICTs, but some do tractors. Girls do a lot of access to water. What they do too is a lot of diversity. Agroforestry is there. A lot of trees. They are very colorful and beautiful farms usually. What that indicates to us somehow is that focusing on ICTs and mechanization is important, but it's not enough. We need to look at creating healthy landscapes. We need to have in mind how the social conditions in village looks like. So we need a very holistic picture. And I don't know, there are now 250 million young people in Africa. Each of them has different aspirations. So there cannot be one policy for youth. We need to have very holistic pictures. We need to have technologies, education, but we shouldn't forget about these more social and environmental aspects too. Thank you.
How many drawings did you get? How old were the kids?
Around 200.
200 artists?
Yes, some are beautiful, others are more crude, but they are all nice.
And age group?
The drawings were people from 15 to 18, 19.
Okay, so teenagers. And how did you go about this? I mean, they were sitting in a classroom or at home or?
Exactly. I mean, first we did interviews and we found that some felt kind of shy to share their views. So we asked them to make the drawings, just give them a sheet of paper and be very free to draw whatever they want. We didn't push them in any direction, and then, yes, it was done in the classroom, and I tried to stay very invisible so that I'm not influencing anything. They were just left with the sheet of paper and then do very beautiful pictures.
And that was in Zambia?
In Zambia, yeah.
Okay, any question? Phyllis?
Well, it appeared to me that perceptions matter in how the youth view agriculture. Have you found, for example, that if farming is just talked about as farming, it's associated with drudgery? But if you talk about the value chain, then the youth can find something to do along the chain.
That's an important point. We didn't look much into the value chain. These were very, very rural areas in Zambia who may not really feel that they're part of the bigger value chain. They use very little inputs, they sell their produce, but it would be very interesting to keep repeating this in more semi-urban settings and also consider the agricultural value chain.
I ask all speakers to move their chairs around behind the table. The audience remembers we first had Oliver Kirui on education issues, then Tekalin Laketa on motivation, aspiration, relative deprivation aspects. Thomas, don't go behind the wall. All shift a little bit here. Georgina on gender lens, Essa Musa, on child labor, and Thomas Daum on the picture youth in rural areas make themselves about their future and their idols. The cross-cutting topic, which I would like to ask to put front and center in this debate with you in the audience. By the way, those of you who are standing, there are a few chairs here, 1, 2 at least. Go ahead. Well, if the lady wants to stand, then another man may move forward. It's the old-fashioned call from me. Front and center should be employment, the big issue, and related policy initiatives. But I saw some of you had hands up and we rapidly moved on. Now is your time. I don't want to dictate that employment should be front and center. Maybe you have other points. I come here and there and there. Go ahead, please. And always say,
thank you.
From where.
I'm Rose Nikal from University of Nairobi. Now, I'll direct my question to the presenter of this. In the area where you did your research, was education relevant with respect to agriculture? The education that the children were receiving at the time? And then, what then would you define as child labor, or rather undesirable child labor?
Okay.
Thank you.
Take notes, please. We take 3 or 4 and then come back to you, colleagues. Next, please. Yeah.
Me?
Go ahead.
My name is Asnahan Arsan from IFAD, Research and Impact Assessment Division. Thank you very much for the presenters. I have maybe one question and one comment. The question is to Essa Musa. And actually your comment, Joachim, that you made about ILO might not like the crossover that people who both studied and worked achieved higher income in the low-skilled self-employment. I think, from that picture from your study, I would take a different lesson actually out of that. Basically, when you look at the evaluation literature, the impact evaluations of the vocational training, mostly urban but also some rural literature that's growing, you see that the education actually doesn't really provide, the vocational training programs don't really work well in terms of providing employment. And going back to education, where you can focus on both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, kind of endows youth much better to deal with the challenges of the employment. So from that picture, I would take, okay, not necessarily, suggest youth to work 2 hours a day plus school, but I would go to the schooling system and I try to think about how the schooling system can be kind of revolutionized, let's say, to bring in the non-cognitive skills that are really important in today's work environment for youth to be able to access employment or create their own, whichever there is. The other one was related to this, to point to Thomas, right? Yeah, the last question. I think that was really important point actually. So in the rural development report for IFA that we're doing now, investing in rural youth, just farm employment is actually kind of very small, and it gets much smaller when you move from rural to semi-rural, peri-urban to urban areas. And then in Africa, when you see the administratively rural classified areas, maybe about actually 50-60% of them are semi-rural and peri-urban when you look at the spatial distribution. So when we think about farming and rural youth, I would definitely recommend having a bigger, broader picture where we bring in this agri-food system and transition in that broader agri-food system.
Sorry, gentlemen, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Hosanna from IFPRI. Very interesting and timely discussions, I guess, in this era of where we are trying to scramble for evidence why especially youth in Africa is leaving agriculture. But my observation to the first presenter is very fascinating data set. I think he mentioned 10,000 observations, and the challenge, or maybe as a way forward follow-up investigation, could be to unpack the 52%. And for me, saying that it's very related to the last presenter in terms of how the youth or the children in Africa sees their future. And I think what we're starting to see is if they are given the opportunity and conducive agricultural environments, we are starting to see even quantitative studies to show that access to land but commercialized agriculture, because the youth may no longer be interested using land to feed their family, but to use it as a capital. So I think first that could be to ask the impression of all the presenters talking about youth and employment or youth in Africa. I am not sure if any of them has mentioned whether access to land has anything to do with their future, but I think those are my observations moving on.
Excellent, all of them. I take one more from the last row and then work forward in the next one. Go ahead.
Thank you. Moti Jaleta from CIMIT. I have two questions, one for Isa and the other one for Takalin. The question to Isa is, you looked into the different orientation of the child work in self-employment, combination and studying only, and then finally looked at the income that they are generating. For me, income is the second level outcome. First should be employment, how much of this thing is really influencing the employment rate of this childhood, the way they take their time in education and self-employment. The question to Takalin is the aspiration. You focus more on the family influence in developing the aspiration of children, but maybe it might go more than that, to their environment and also the family network, their uncles, aunts who are employed somewhere and left out the village. So I don't know whether you have looked into that or not. Thank you.
Yeah. We still have about half an hour together. don't hesitate to also press them for methodological and conceptual questions in the next round. Let's start from you, Oliver, and go quickly through the line if you would pick what has been asked.
Right. Thank you for your questions and your comments, and I agree. I think only one or two relates to my area, and yes, unpacking the 52%, the group, the majority of this youth. And I agree with you that yes, there are many things that we can do, and I guess there is a responsibility for everyone here. I guess at this stage, I will say the best way forward for the rural youth in Africa is not just about the education and skills alone. There is a role that the government, the state can do, the public sector can do. We need infrastructure. We need infrastructure not only in terms of roads to access the markets and all this, but we also need infrastructure in terms of educational facilities, in terms of, when you say vocational training, what kind of training are we talking about? What tools and equipment, what kind of classrooms, what kind of practical skills are people, are these youth attaining or gaining from these vocational schools? And we need more jobs, definitely. And this is a call to the private sector. So what the private sector needs to invest more in, we talk about value addition, shift more of these jobs to the rural areas from the cities and from the industrial zones. And let's generate a vibrant rural economy where we have more people participating. We can source raw materials from the youth, from the rural areas and so forth. And much more so, the programs in our schools should not only focus on the cognitive skills, but as somebody said already here, we need to think entrepreneur. We need to think how do we want to see the rural youth? We don't want to see him as a dependent person, but rather somehow independent person who can make decisions of his own, and someone who can use his own abilities and skills, but also influence the others and gain more practical skills.
Oliver, you have looked into the LSMS agriculture surveys. What do you see there if you have looked into the relationship between education and land? There was a land question.
Yes.
Larger farm, more investment in education, or opposite? What do you see?
I think it varies from country to country. When we look at this, yes, it's not
then let's leave that out. But I think it's an important research question.
Yeah.
The structural transformation creates incentive for rural education.
Exactly.
Anyway,
okay. Thank you for the question. I think regarding the technical and vocational schooling, Oliver has already mentioned, but just a sentence that the effectiveness of technical and vocational schooling in the labor market depends on the system, how the labor market is functioning. But my study does not focus the technical and vocational schooling. It's all about what happened during childhood, their school participation, elementary school participation, and work participation. So I know the suggestion that those who combine the schooling and working doesn't test good for ILO. I mean, because for an organization who try to discourage working, if I suggest that working and schooling actually is one of the mechanisms that children can improve their earnings and their outcomes later in life, might not be interesting, but that's the result, right? So I would argue that this could be the reason why, in the rural areas, parents use, they guide their offsprings and different work activities to participate in different work activities so that they can learn soft skills and to be better in their lives. So it's one of the mechanisms, one of the ways to transfer the knowledge and the technical skills in working, farming, and other activities. So it's just part of the channel. So regarding access to land, in this survey, access to land was, I think, the fourth factor following what actually you need to stay in the rural areas. So they said first they need jobs, and second, skills and trainings, and third, technologies. But the fourth was access to land. So it wasn't among the first or the first or among the second factors, rather to the fourth factor by the youth. And regarding the employment trajectories, actually I did not analyze in the econometric model, but the descriptive statistics show that those who were exclusively working during their childhood, most of them, they remain in the rural area. And 2/3 of those who are working in farming during adulthood or youthhood were those who those who were exclusively working during their childhood. And those who combining working and schooling during their childhood, almost 42%, they join the non-farm economic activities later in life. But that's proportion was 24% for those who were exclusively working during their childhood. So there is significant variation in terms of their occupational trajectories later in life.
There was a question, how do you define child labor? I mean, we shouldn't hesitate to say there's, of course, hazardous child labor, which has to be flatly rejected. How did you define child labor?
In my study, I defined child labor as childhood work, participating in different activities, be it in farming or non-farm activities. If the child works at least 1 hour in the last 7 days, either in farming or non-farm activities, the child is categorized as a participant of childhood work, not 24 or 28 hours that the UNICEF is using. So it's just participation at least 1 hour in the last 7 days.
Georgina, any responses from you?
Yes, with regard to land and women, well, most women in Africa lack access to land, and those that have access to land is mainly through their husbands, or those that have access to land is they are less fertile pieces compared to the men. And also we see others are inhibited from inheriting land in case of demise of their husbands, and this of course in turn impacts on their productivity. They are not able to produce at the same level as the men. And having land as a key input to production then, and also land being conditional to access of other services such as finances, and also access or membership to agricultural organizations, then it means that women cannot upgrade to higher levels of value chains. They cannot produce at the same level as the men, and it continues. It's like a vicious cycle whereby their output is forever at the bottom.
Those are basically key points which are in a recent working paper which you published in the CEF working paper series. Take a look.
I want to capitalize on this land issue. Specifically for this study, I used the Agricultural Growth Program database, which is the agricultural potential areas where land size is more or less higher than the national average. And what's surprising there is that, you know, land was not a problem there. What's problem there was a perception and sometimes lack of the skills necessary to invest and make use of those available lands. So the point is creating access to land or other resource is not sufficient to realize that. So other skills are necessary, which brings me to the second point raised on how aspirations are formed and why aspirations are important. And Professor von Braun mentioned the concept of this relative deprivation. When you talk of this relative deprivation, more or less is a concept where you perceive yourself compared to others, which means the peer effects. So specifically in this study, when I define this relative deprivation and trying to analyze how it affects their aspirations and their motivations, I not only consider the family, but I also consider the environment, their peers, meaning those in similar education, in similar age, in their environment, and different sorts of reference groups. So that is taken care of. And more or less the results are robust, irrespective of whether families, reference groups, or peer effect is considered, environment is considered, age is considered, education is considered. More or less the results are consistent.
I think the concept of relative deprivation is still not yet sufficiently paid attention to in our profession. Yes, we have absolute poverty and we have lots of attention to pay to income inequality and asset inequality, but with access to information changing, the aspirations, people, especially in rural areas, Africa and elsewhere in the world, see where they stand relative to others. They may have moved up together, but they see the gaps. And this is so fundamental to, do I stay on the farm? Do I stay where I live? Do I make a living here? Or do I aspire to cross the Mediterranean? So these are hugely important concepts, which I hope we see more relative deprivation economics research related to agricultural economics in the future in our conference. Thomas, please.
Yes, I think I would want to pick up on the question from the lady from Kenya on education. I mean, to be a bit provocative, I think education in that context played very little role, because the quality of education is bad, and the type of education that the children are getting in this area is much too theoretical. I mean, the classes are huge. There may be 120 children sitting in one class, and they may be tired because they have anemia. They may not understand the language of the teacher, and the type of education they are getting is much too theoretical. There is very little vocational training happening in the whole area, and I think that's something we need much more to make it relevant for them. And I guess this is also addressing the point of Gideon. If we have education happening that is too theoretical, it will not help them to get any meaningful choice. And we see mechanization happening, and ICT revolution is happening, but without really the skills to participate in that, to work as part of agricultural value chains, they're pretty much wasting their time. Okay. And on labor, I wanted to just very quickly, because of the time use studies that we did, we collect a lot of very detailed labor data from children, and everyone is working a huge amount of time. I think certainly everyone more than 1 hour a week. And what is interesting too is that boys and girls do very different things. And I wanted to ask you, in fact, because girls do a lot of domestic works, and I'm not sure how that translates into higher aspirations and a higher income later. So there may be a very strong gender aspect to look into.
Yes, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah.
How do girls work, and what does this mean for their moving up and out?
There is a significant difference in terms of the types of activities they did during their childhood. Girls were more likely to work in domestic activities, fetching water, collecting firewoods, and also taking care of younger siblings, and then just indoor activities. But there are also a sizable proportion of girls who also work in cattle herding, whereas boys were helping parents in farming and also cattle herding. So boys were less likely to work in domestic activities like girls. But in terms of the long-term occupational trajectories, I found that in terms of migration, actually, girls were more likely to migrate, but for marriage reasons. So most of the girls later on, I found them as housewives, not working in the labor market.
Well, but that may be endogenous. The marriage, studies in marriage. I'd like to take a few from up front and into the middle. I think I favored the back seat so far. Let me start there. Go ahead.
I just
and brief questions, and we need to be a bit faster with the response.
Just a quick clarification on the child labor issue, because I noticed while I was growing up, I was helping my mom, and I didn't necessarily see that as child labor. Basically, from the graph you showed also, we noticed that those who were working and somehow schooling tend to do better in terms of their incomes. And I would say, I mean, some of the skills that children pick up while growing and applying this in their profession somehow also makes them better off in the future. So would you recommend that as an approach for which we need to adopt more, or something that we should throw away? And for Oliver, what would be your recommendation in terms of policy angle for vocational training in Africa? If you have to recommend something for politicians, what would you say?
Okay. I mean, definitely help your mother, I would say.
Gabriel from the Elementary Special Institute. My question is to Oliver and maybe South America. I found that about 52% would like to stay in rural areas, of which 37 states stated that they need education. Whereas in the Musa's presentation we saw that those who were at school actually ended up in formal, what you call non-farm employment. So how much can we trust their responses? Because I mean, at least in Ethiopia, when you ask students, they usually say that they would like to get employment in non-farm activities. So I'm wondering what kind of education they were seeking to stay in rural areas. Is that professional or something else? Yeah. Second question is, what type of job can we create in rural developing countries where infrastructure is really poor for rural areas? So what type of jobs can we really create?
Okay. Very important question. What type of jobs?
Yeah.
And how create?
Yeah.
And who is we? Please take it.
Yeah, actually, one is on the child labor issues, because when you are trying to compare those who are participating at the childhood with work with those who are not involved with, I mean, the inherent characteristics, the abilities. For example, those smart people, those who are able to navigate the work environment could join the labor force even at the earlier stage. So I will not be surprised if these guys are also earning more at the latter stage, because the initial difference could exist. And the other thing is about your survey. For example, you ask whether the children participated in the last 7 days. We say renewable. Then after some years, you ask their income status, and labor market outcomes, and some years later. So were they graduated or were they still at school age? Because if those were at school, could probably be even now at school when you do the final survey, the final rule of the survey. So it goes just like that. So everything seems endogenous. My other concern is most of the presentation focus on the number of jobs, the quantity of jobs created in the sector. What about the quality of jobs? For example, why the youth is leaving, a substantial number of youth leaving agriculture, and still more is entering into agriculture. This could be related to aspiration, but at the same time, it's basic labor market fundamentals. And education also. There is also this education in youth unemployment. How do you deal with that? Have you, especially, or do you try to address the skill mismatch problem in the job search and reach costs while you are addressing the impact of the different types of training? And actually, the impact of training is also questionable.
Okay. One, two, and then next one comes here. And then we close. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question for Tikuri. Usually, there is often this in the social network literature.
Please speak a bit more loud. It's being taped. If you don't want to be taped, don't speak.
Often we can see that for from one individual there is a misunderstanding about the situation of the other individual or the peer in terms of technology adoption or anything related to the object. So I was wondering, when you measure the aspirations of the peer for the peer effect, whether you have taken that into account.
Thank you. Last in this round, please.
So, hi. My name is Athena Birkenberg from Hohenheim University. I would like to raise a question on the aspiration of the youth. I think you were very much focusing on the youth themselves, but what about the role of adults or the parents as a role model also? If they can show that their job in agriculture gives them a good living and they are proud of it and happy and healthy, that might drive even more youth into agriculture.
Lovely question, particularly in last it's a whole chapter. Let's start with Thomas this time. Yeah? Anything you would like to respond to? Okay, tackle it.
I will start maybe on what kind of jobs. As we all study, we come up with policy recommendations. I focus on rural use in agriculture, and I find out agriculture could be attractive if certain conditions are fulfilled. Number one, you mentioned infrastructure. Yes, there is a need to invest in infrastructure, but at the same time, I will still say that having someone as a role model affects how others become entrepreneurs. So government has to focus really on changing the attitudinal and behavioral aspect of those young people, not only in terms of providing jobs, but also disseminating information, creating information, and making use of the available resources. So source of job, agriculture is still important. Yes, it's not only dominant labor force in agriculture, but agriculture can be really a business. And I have seen hundreds of young people who have turned agriculture into a business, especially on those irrigation areas. So I think there is a need to invest in irrigation and the related input supply aspect, so that they could turn to business. When it comes to the information of other peers and the role of parents and adults, I didn't present as Professor Von Braun said, but when we talk of peer effect, I try to understand not only the effect of the parents or the mother or the brother, but what about the effect of the colleague? So that colleague is defined. I didn't define them as a reference group for them. In the survey, I asked them, who are your reference groups? Who are guys or peers against which you form your aspirations, your motivation, your career objectives? So they gave us different aspects and I tried to see how those definitions could result in those kind of aspirations. So that is taken care of, and if you are interested, you can, it's upcoming in the journals, but you can see the details on ZEF discussion paper and African Development Bank working paper series.
Okay. I said, Georgina, Oliver, any comment?
No.
Yeah.
I will start with the policy recommendation for that time for education. My first policy recommendation is that policymakers should address the exclusive child labor, because exclusive child laborers, they perform lower in terms of their earnings, in terms of their human capital formation, compared to the rest. So exclusive child labor should be abandoned or addressed. But regarding combining schooling and working, I mean, child labor or participating or engaging children in works exists in the community. So the role of the government should be providing schooling and incentives so that children also participate in schooling. So in that case, you can find the balance between the two. The only thing that government can do is that just provide schooling and give incentives so that parents also send their children to school. And then what type of jobs would you recommend? In my study, those who are educated or childhood school children, those who fully attending schooling and also combining school. They are migrated, most of them, they migrated and working in non-farm economic activities. So also supported by this 10,000 rural youth survey, I argue that if we provide non-farm employment opportunities in the rural areas, especially along the food value chain, that might employ a huge number of youth and help to engage educated rural youth in the rural areas. The indigeneity problem, yeah, it exists, the indigeneity problem. This is a simple marginal analysis. I hope you have understood my presentation. This is a simple marginal analysis which does not talk about the indigenous problem. But I controlled the time of survey in my analysis. And also I used the IVs to predict the likelihood of childhood labor market participation so that I can predict the earnings. But in the economic analysis, I addressed the indigenous problem.
Yeah, I'll combine 2 questions or 3 questions together. You talked about what quality versus quantity of jobs. Also, there is policy recommendations in terms of what do we mean by what does it mean for vocational training. I mean, for that, I would say, in terms of policy recommendation, we need to sit back as governments and as countries and really realize that not every one of the youth will end up in a blue collar or a white collar job. Somehow we need to teach them also the other jobs that we're talking about. And we need a proper vocational training program. This training where people, they say vocational training and you end up with 90% theory and only 10% practical, they will not learn anything. This is just another schooling for the adults. So we will need to prepare a proper vocational training program. In one of our discussion papers, in one of our working papers, we've described how we can adopt perhaps the German system of vocational training or even the Australian or Canadian, which has quite a 50-50 kind of sharing in terms of that. And we also need to have a better remuneration for vocationally trained people. If you go to make it really very cheap, that you get $1 a day for whatever job you do in this kind of jobs, you will never attract any young people to do this kind of job, or even anyone who will be interested in that. So we need a proper remuneration structure and a proper kind of roll out a proper training program. We will need more quality jobs, as we may call them, quality in terms of that. We need the low-hanging fruits, I will call them. Public works in the rural areas. Look at the road infrastructure in the rural areas. These are the first opportunities that we can start engaging the young people, give them jobs. Let us create jobs in the rural, create roads in the rural areas, the electricity, and all this. And then we slowly then go into value addition in rural areas and attract investors and rural industries. Then we have better quality jobs, as Musa was saying. Yeah. And
okay. Sorry, did I cut you off? You have a number saying.
Yes, I wanted to say this.
Stop it.
In the era of global information, global trade, and really globalization that is going on, intelligent automation, we need to train people on proper tools and proper equipment and proper things. I don't see agriculture in Africa continuing the way it is for ages. I would be happy to see 2-wheeler tractors, some youth controlling with some drones and doing farming and enjoying it and enjoying music and sitting at the farm and saying, this is what I love doing, and they don't feel they're out of this space.
Okay. Oliver, occupational technical training for one person costs between $3,000 and $5,000. That was a wish list which you put before us. Yeah. We have to start thinking about hard costing returns. You mentioned public works. A public works job, unskilled labor, costs between $500 and $1,000 a year. I think we also need to get our numbers right on creating jobs in the agricultural value chains, which several of you mentioned. We need to quantify that. Africa would, I gave you the numbers at the outset. If you turn it into daily job creation, you come to 100,000 jobs needed per day, incrementally, for young people entering the labor market. Yeah, about 30 million a year, 100,000 a day. So I think we need to really become economically focused and operational with policy recommendations. And there are huge trade-offs. That's what the G20 Marshall Plan with Africa tries, but the money hasn't yet come sufficiently to the table. I promised last round here. Go ahead, please.
So Martin from the Institute of Foreign Resource Economics, in Germany. So I have 2 questions for Tekali. The first thing, consider aspirations. If I understand well, aspirations are very broad. So what aspects of aspirations for these rural youths did you capture? And did you capture the aspiration of the youth or the aspirations of the parents towards the youth? Because depending on the both, and if you captured both, where did you get the strongest influence? Because I see them to be too strong, in the sense that as a parent, I may want my son to remain in agriculture, but he wants to go to the city for a non-farm job. Otherwise, as a parent, I may want him to exit the village, the rural area, and go to the city, but he wants to remain in agriculture. So where did you get the highest impact on that? And I'm also, these aspirations are actually very different from wishes. How did you tackle that? And I understand if they're different from wishes, they have some efforts, they have some motivations which are triggering them. So did you go a step further to see how these aspirations measure the future-oriented behaviors of these youths? Because one thing with aspirations is the fact that if you have no aspirations, then you should get to your low poverty status. What did you do? And maybe in the third stage, the person on gender may want to say something. Did you also capture the aspirations of the rural females? Because the fact that we are youth is not just enough, but females, it paints another very big picture. So did you?
Okay. Good. Can I see a sign of hand who would be angry if I cut it off now? 1, 2. Both of you, please go ahead.
Okay, Accompanying from the University of Göttingen. My question relates to the quality and quantity of jobs and to what you just said. I'm wondering if there are any real-world examples of countries or regions or institutions that actually achieved creating those jobs, possibly even at a very low cost.
I'd be happy to comment on that if they don't. Go ahead.
This Gideon Kuzma from CIMIT. This is on following up on what was the gentleman in front of me commented and what was said earlier. It is very much about the definition question. Being a youth, it's part of a process. It's a social construct. You're not just a youth because of your age, but it's because of your relationship with your family, your peers, your community. And it's something which is dynamic. You do not stay a youth forever. As the years go on, you move into to other stages which are defined by the setting in which you operate. That also relates to the definition of what is child labor. Just go back to there is a number of people here who are from Europe or the U.S. Only a generation ago, in rural areas in Europe, during some of the peak labor seasons, schools would only operate in the morning, so that children could go out could go home and help. Whereas in all these countries, there are very, very, very strict laws outlawing child labor. So fixating on the fact that children do work within family business, the family businesses, including farms, might be really misleading in terms of child labor. Completely, what Joachim said earlier, at the outset, there is also the kind of child labor where children work 12 hours a day making bricks, where their opportunities in life are completely shaped by that work, and their possibilities for work are very limited because of these occupations. Completely different story.
Well, I took this as a plea to disaggregate, which maybe for brevity of time you were not sufficiently doing according to that intervention. There was one more hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Mulukan from Humboldt University of Berlin. Well, one quick question for Musa is, like you said, like 1 hour for the last 7 days, right?
Just 1 hour.
Yeah, exactly. I was just wondering, really, if you ask me this question, I would be like, what kind of boy is that in a rural area who is not working helping his parents for one hour for the last 7 days? Because, for instance, I'm from rural area. I was working after school, as you mentioned, like every afternoon. I'm a kind of shopkeeper, but like I was saying, like, what kind of boy is this? He's not helping his parent for 1 hour.
I think you got it wrong. He counts the hours. He counts the hours from 1 to 12 and so on. So it's not he doesn't deal with a dummy variable.
No, I know, yes, but for the last
So what's
7
your
days,
point?
1 hour, right?
Yeah, but
At least, exactly.
But this is not a child worker coming just to help. So what's your point?
Yeah, that is my question. I think you get my point. Well, overall, I was just wondering in general, because like now we are talking about this rural youth, and it's really very interesting symposium. I really enjoyed it. But I was also thinking, like, are we really dreaming here, or is it really the reality there in rural areas somehow? Because like in rural areas now, like for instance, if we take Ethiopia, people have, I mean, like the youth are really inspiring something else. I mean, in my understanding. So when you are really talking about transformation of African agriculture, really, are we dreaming, or are we just really talking what's really possible at the ground level? This is basically maybe some of the response.
Okay. Are we dreaming? Are you guys dreaming? And if so, about what? Please. Quick round, and then we wrap it up. And you corner them before they leave the room if you are not satisfied with the answers. Let's start here.
Yes, just what Gideon said, it's very interesting. Like in Germany, the school holidays, for example, are very much aligned according to the harvesting and everything. And in many African countries, it's not the case. And that keeps children from going to school. So that's something we can do very quickly to reduce child labor. And then what you ask, I think, is a very important question. I think there are examples in Asia where we found ways to absorb labor. But for Africa it will be very difficult, I think, because China is still producing very cheap, and they still have relatively low wages, and they have economics of scale. To compete with this kind of work is difficult. But I think there are a lot of very interesting research questions that we need to address to find ways to create jobs and to create meaningful jobs.
Okay, very good. Okay.
As to the aspiration, what kind of aspiration is that parents or youth that have been, and I'm stating about youth, that at the same time the impact of the parents' aspiration or the youth's aspiration as well. So specifically the target is, the main subject is young people, youth aspiration, but how at the same time also parents' expectation and aspiration affects the youth themselves. That is the first one. Wishes and aspirations. Yes, true. Here we are not measuring, and I was not talking about wishes or expectations. I'm specifically talking about aspirations, and as you know, there are different ways of measuring aspiration. As Professor Von Braun also alluded, specifically here I use the concept of relative deprivation, where you have, say, a certain income. I define that in terms of income, in terms of wealth, in terms of social capital. So we know your income is realized, the realized income, and also the income of others. And so based on that, you can compute your income and position distant from others' income. In other words, for example, you know the concept of relative income. So pretty much closer to that. So in short, I was not talking about wishes, but aspirations, and that's very clear literature to measure, quantify that along those dimensions. In terms of quality and quantity, I will not talk of quantity, but recently I was reviewing a social program in Africa where a lot of government investment, donor investments have been put into creating the quantities of jobs across African continents, and the result is mixed. I mean, $1 billion have been invested in some countries, in Sub-Saharan African countries. There are successful social programs where employment, incomes have been generated, and in others, not. And I will leave it, maybe the quality for Professor Bond. Are we, is that a reality or a dream? You know, dreams are very important to realize it. So here, when I took this topic, I started with having in mind youths are not attracted in agriculture, so I thought I could study what youths are exiting agriculture and what factors. And Professor Von Braun told me, as a researcher, you have to be open-minded. You never know whether you are leaving, or whether they are leaving, or whether they are residing. And I was completely proved, he proved me wrong, and I find out that there are those who are aspire to transform agriculture, especially in agricultural potential areas where they try to convert really agriculture as a business, making not only hundreds, but making millions, especially in Bali, in Arsi, especially in agricultural potential areas. So, but at the same time, to create reality, aspirations, dreams are very important. And very quickly to the point you raised, yes, use is a process, but never forget that you are what you eat, meaning, for example, we are youth, the investment you make in child in youth will determine your life fit at the latter stage. So it's very important, never forget that.
Okay.
Yeah, I just quickly would like to address the issue of child definition. First, we need to understand that there is no universally agreed definition for child labor. The International Convention for Child Labor defines child labor as anyone who works during the age of below 14 is called a child laborer. And countries, they either increase or decrease based on their context. And that's one of the definition of child labor. But I do not take that because the local context in Ethiopia does not allow that. So, and even within Ethiopia, it varies from place to place. And this study is done in 5 districts in rural Ethiopia: Debre Birhan, Ankober, Bugna, Karsa, in Misrak Hararge zone, and also in south. So, the number of hours children work in the last 7 days depends on the survey time, which I control, the age of the child, those who, because my study includes those children between 4 and 14 years old. So you cannot expect all these children to work the same level type of activities with the same number of hours in the last 7 days. So you can expect that variation, but you cannot rule out the number of the share of children who did not work at all in the last 7 days. That's one. Second, since there is no universally agreed definition for child labor, I try to include different measures of child labor. In addition to the number of hours they work in the last 7 days, I also use the age at which children started working in different activities, and also the combination which I already presented.
Please meet each other in the coffee break.
My concluding statement is that, yes, agricultural transformation is happening in Africa, but as it were, the labor force, and particularly the youth, are not prepared to take advantage of the opportunities and possibilities that are coming. So they will need help in terms of training and education opportunities for them to be able to participate and enjoy.
Well, it's this panel painted a differentiated picture of what's going on with youth aspirations or lack thereof, the job opportunities, by gender, but it was not our task to make this as a policy panel on how to solve the African employment problem. That was not our terms of reference. But we need to have this type of detailed research. I think the most important contribution from all 5 of them was an attempt to understand in socioeconomic and hard economic sense the drivers of what young people in Africa and elsewhere are aiming for, and what's in it for them. The opportunities in the labor market will only be 2, and the number 1 opportunity in rural African labor markets are entrepreneurship, self-employment in a more productive service and small manufacturing sector. That's number 1. It's probably 80% of the bill. And only much less the education and training for formal employment, be it in government, in public services or industry. So this entrepreneurial spirit seems to be there in the drawings, in the econometrics, wherever you look here, among the boys and girls. And in between, your question, is there any place on earth where these 100,000 jobs a day have been created? Yes. China had huge public works programs up into the early 1990s. Spent about $10 billion a year on it, on 4 work programs. They're not very productive, but got the boys from the street. India still has it. The largest employment program in the world is India's Gandhi Narega, so-called Narega program, which also employs tens of millions. Africa had such programs 40 years ago. They were dismantled during structural adjustment. They need to come back, but they are not the long-term solution. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.